I could not sleep. Not the poetic kind of insomnia. Just nights that stretched and folded into mornings while my phone kept glowing on the bedside table. The lamp in the living room hummed like a small animal refusing to die, and the ceiling fan made that thin click at every rotation that felt like a second hand counting down to something I could not name. People told me I looked tired. I said I was fine so many times that the phrase stopped meaning anything. The apartment smelled faintly of burned toast and lemon cleaner. The texture of the sofa under my palms was worn and a little sticky, and the window curtains always stuck slightly when I tried to pull them closed. Then one night, a sentence landed inside my head fully formed, as if someone had slipped a note under my skull. You were not supposed to click this. It was not a whisper. It fell flat and factual. I thought it was stress, or too many videos late at night, or some absurd joke. I brushed my teeth more carefully than usual. I told myself it was a thought like any other. The next morning, my email showed a message I had not opened, and the subject line read exactly what I had heard. The battery on my phone was at 39%. The kettle was half full. My hands rattled. I began hearing the voice as a voice on a track I could not pause. At first, it annotated my small actions as if I were a documentary and I had agreed to be filmed. You scroll without seeing. You reheat coffee you will not drink. You tell Daniel you are fine. It named things I had not yet done, and the names it used were precise, like a person who had looked at my file. I tried testing it. I moved the mug and waited. It said, "You move the mug." Then it said, "You think about moving it again." I laughed at my own ridiculousness and called Mia. I said the words out loud to someone who had known me since childhood and expected scorn or consolation. She listened and then said, "Maybe you are exhausted." She told me to sleep. I shut my eyes and lay there while the fan clicked and the voice murmured, "You will not sleep. You will listen." I told myself, sleep deprivation explains intrusive thoughts. I told myself 1,000 other small lies. When the front door was found open at 1 in the morning, with no sign of forced entry, and the hallway smelled faintly of someone else who had been there, the lies stopped holding. My life before this was a pattern stitched with small certainties. I grew up in a house where the radiator banged at night, and my mother, Lena, would make tea to smooth the house into something warmer. My father left when I was young, and the absence left a line of caution in me that looked like careful doors and light switches. In college, I studied design and learned to make order from messy content. I dated, left, and learned the vocabulary of small apologies. I lost a roommate, Marco, to a hospitalization that no one wanted to discuss, and that loss made me good at arranging rooms and people in ways that minimized surprise. I worked late hours with Sarah and Daniel on a small media team that told other people's stories so I could avoid telling my own. Those facts were my armor and also my prison. The present complication is that armor fits differently now. The voice is not a stranger writing footnotes. It corrals my days and edits my memory. It knows the texture of the toothbrush I prefer, the sound the kettle makes, what Lena used to hum while she washed dishes. It knows the wrong way I cut an apple. The more it knew, the more it felt like someone else had the pen to my life. When I tried to make the problem external, someone named Officer Ruiz came to the apartment and asked calm questions that sounded rehearsed. I explained the open door, the sentence, the emails. He wrote down what I said, his pen scratching like a small insect. He said, "Sometimes people feel watched, and there is a reasonable explanation." He asked if anyone else had access to the building. He took my statement and left a card. Later, speaking with Dr. Hayes at the clinic, I told the story again, and she said, "It could be a dissociative phenomenon." She tapped a pen and smelled faintly of antiseptic and peppermint gum. Daniel called twice that afternoon, worried, and when I told him about the email, he said, "Forward it to me." I did. He replied, "This is not okay." The exchanges multiplied. Me to Officer Ruiz, me to Dr. Hayes, me to Daniel, me to Mia, me to Lena. Each name anchored me for a few minutes. Each response slid away. In one phone call with Marco, I asked, "Are you sure you saw the door closed?" He said, "I did." Then the camera footage I paid for showed nothing but a frame where someone had blurred the hallway precisely where a figure should be. The image had a wash of static that smelled like old electronics and hot plastic when I leaned in close. At night, the fan kept clicking, and the sentence in my head shifted to, "You test evidence, you lose it." I planted more tests because denial was no longer a shelter. I left a tape recorder on the kitchen table to catch any sound. I labeled cups and took photographs that I stacked in a folder named Proof. The voice began to taunt with small edits. You put a sticker on the cup, the sticker peels off. You circle a date, the date changes. It hit with accuracy that felt like malice. Once, when I left a note for Lena on the fridge, the handwriting on the note in the morning matched mine, but the content was wrong, and the smell of the ink was sour, like a pencil chewed by a child. I called Lena and there was nothing there, and when I opened my phone, her contact read just Lena with no number. I said, "Lena, are you there?" The voice said, "She never existed." I pressed my palm to the cool metal of the fridge and felt the pattern of the magnet like a fossil. It should have been comfort to remember childhood details, but instead those memories began to fray, as if someone were erasing edges with a sponge. At the 1/3 mark of everything that came after, there was a moment when I paused and decided to ask you to tell me something small. If you have ever had a tiny thing blow up inside your head until it became a wave that swallowed your days, write about it. Start your comment with, "It began when," and then say one short sentence. That sentence helps me read you properly. It helps you name it for yourself, and maybe that naming tightens a knot in the chest. I will read them. I will collect them like scraps. Your line could make someone else feel less alone. Your line could give me a breadcrumb. After you leave that sentence, I will come back to the story. For now, picture the click of a fan and a sentence you did not think you would hear. Picture a note that rearranges itself when you blink. When people told me to sleep more, I asked them to type their replies and send them. Some sent sympathy and hearts. Others sent links to forums. A woman named Sarah wrote, "You need a break." A man named Daniel sent a news clip about online pranks. Officer Ruiz left a voicemail, "We will look into the cameras." Dr. Hayes recommended a sleep study. The first confirmed prediction came quietly and then like a slap. One evening I was at my desk and the light in the hall went out in a slow, wet way. And then the phrase came clean and sure, "There will be a knock." I told myself that if I waited long enough, the world would move without special providence. The knock came, 3 raps at the door, like someone striking a drum stuck in a case. I told myself to breathe. The knock happened again, this time a softer pattern. I opened the pee-hole. Nothing. The hallway was a smear of yellow light and drywall. I leaned my forehead against the cool wood, and the voice said, "He is here. He waits." I backed away and sat on the floor and heard the swell of my own blood. For the first time, I felt more than unsettled. I felt observed in a way that smelled like metal. I called Officer Ruiz. He came, looked, and said, "The building cameras show nothing at that time." He said the sentence slowly as if tasting it. He listened, and his jaw ticked. Daniel arrived later, holding a thermos and wearing a fleece I had given him months before. He said, "Maybe someone is messing with you online." He spoke with the quick certainty of someone who still believed in simple causes. He asked to see the email again, and when I opened it, the subject line had changed to a phrase I did not recognize, and the body was blank. The hair on my arms stood into tiny ridges. Then Lena disappeared. One night she texted me that she would come by, and we would have dinner the way we used to, and I told her I would buy bread and that I would be home by 7. At 6:59, I was in the kitchen chopping an apple. The voice said, "She will be late." I heard a cab pass and the radiator thump. At 7:30, I called and the line simply rang into nothing. At 8:30, I went to the building across the street where she worked, and the receptionist said, "There is no Lena here." I laughed because the reaction felt like a reflex, but then I saw the photo on the reception wall of staff, and there was another woman in Lena's jacket whose face was blurred by editing. I ran back home, and for the first time, the photographs I had kept in a box looked wrong. In the photo of my 8th birthday, the candles were smudged like someone had dragged their thumb across the pixels. When I called Mia, she said, "I came by your place and left. You did not answer the door." She was steady in a way that should have been comforting. Officer Ruiz took a report and said, "We will check social media." He said the words and left space between them like rope. I slept badly and woke with a voice in my ear. "You will look, and then you will forget." The reality began to wobble subtly and then in bigger, wrong ways. Clocks changed by minutes, sometimes hours, like a deck of cards being shuffled. My reflection in the bathroom mirror paused half a breath behind my movements and then caught up, as if it were watching from a small delay. I tested this for an hour. I lifted my hand and the mirror nearly lagged. I placed concealer on a small scratch on my cheek, and in the reflection the scratch was deeper. The fridge whispered sometimes in the night, like a thing trying to say a name. I took a hammer to the old wall clock, and it broke into quiet pieces that no longer told time. The voice narrated while I broke it. "You break what measures you." I tried to measure myself against facts, and the facts drifted. When I replayed recorded footage, the sound was one frame off from the image, and the smell of the room in the clip was wrong in a way I could not define. I held the texture of the sofa, and it felt slightly unfamiliar, like holding a book you remember reading but whose pages are now blank. I called Dr. Hayes and asked, "Is this possible, that memory can be resequenced?" She said, "In theory, yes. In practice, we call it a dissociative episode or a form of complex trauma." Her office smelled like leather and lavender. She asked me about Marco, and I told her, and she looked at me as if cataloging evidence. I felt small. Confrontation with the voice was inevitable, and it became a scene of its own. I sat on the floor with my back against the couch, and I said aloud, "Who are you?" There was a pause that felt like a held breath in a theater, and then the voice replied, in the same flat tone it had always used, "I am what you clicked. You clicked a link, and I found a hole." I said, "This is not a joke." The voice said, "You do not understand the contract." I asked, "What contract?" It said, "The one you signed without reading." I accused it of being cruel. It said, "Cruelty is subjective." I shouted, "Why, Lena?" It said, "She was part of a draft." I whispered, "What do you want?" It said, "A story." I said, "I will not play." It said, "You already are." I pleaded with it, "Leave us alone." It said, "Not until the audience is satisfied." I kept asking, and the voice kept answering, and the back and forth kept tightening like a hand around my throat. There were at least 9 exchanges that night, each a smaller and more precise instrument of fear. The room smelled of cold metal and the faint lemon of the cleaner. My tongue tasted of copper. I felt the carpet fibers prick the backs of my knees. When the voice mentioned details it had not been told aloud in months, those details changed in my memory until I could not tell whether I had spoken them or it had. There were moments of tension that split the air into thin, sharp planes. The first lasted long enough to bruise. I had taped my phone to a bookshelf with the camera pointed at the doorway and lay beneath a blanket, the fabric pressing patterns into my skin. The phone vibrated on the shelf, and the voice said, "He will come through the door." I watched a shadow cross the threshold on the tiny screen, and the sound of someone breathing came through the speaker like a second heart. I crawled toward the camera, and my palms were damp and cold. My mouth was dry, and the air smelled faintly of rain, even though it was dry outside. The shadow paused directly under the sensor, and then the light in the corridor went out, and the recording cut. When the footage resumed, the couch was overturned, and a cup was on the floor. There was a smear that might have been a fingerprint. I felt like the room had been hollowed out and refilled with other things. That moment was 522 characters of pure panic when I later tried to write it, but that is not how the memory sits. It sits like glass under a boot. Another temporal tear came when I knocked on the apartment across the hall where my neighbor, Marco, had been staying after his discharge. He answered, and his voice seemed distant and small. I said, "Marco, are you okay?" He said, "I am fine." I said, "Do you remember last week?" He said, "No." He looked at me like someone cataloging someone else. The kitchen smelled of frying oil and something sweet. He blinked slowly, and the light above him hummed. I touched the laminate of his table, and it felt warm. Then his expression slid away, and he said, "You should not have clicked." The two paragraphs that describe this point in my notes are lean and jagged, 539 characters each when I measured them in fits of mania. The sense of time broke down. I walked back to my place, and the hallway carpet seemed longer. The door was latched but not locked, and when I opened it, the living room felt like it had been rearranged for someone I did not know. The crescendo came with something that resembled a massacre of memory. The voice produced images, and I saw them as if through someone else's feed. Photos where faces melted into blank space, videos that stopped and then played frames that should not have existed, texts that arrived unread and then vanished. It started with a family dinner where the table was right, and everyone had chairs, and there was bread and red wine. Then someone said, "Where is Sarah?" And someone else said, "She is not in this frame." Plates clattered. The sound was shredded like tissue. I called Sarah on my phone, and her number rang, and then a reply came in text form from a number I did not know. "She is elsewhere." The reply had a timestamp from a time that had not yet happened. I had at least 6 characters of dialogue with my own trembling voice and the unseen sender before the thread went blank and the kitchen light dimmed to a color I do not have a name for. The smell of garlic vanished, and the taste in my mouth was stale and chemical. My photographs seemed to rearrange themselves. In one, the people at the table had missing eyes. In another, a hand reached where it did not belong. The final phase was a test of endurance. There were scenes where I could only describe pain. I was held on a mattress in a room with a single lamp that buzzed like a trapped insect, and my hands were restrained by straps that smelled like new leather. Each time I blinked, the tape recorder on the nightstand played a phrase the voice had used earlier, and the words felt like salt in an open wound. I begged and I negotiated. I offered names, places, false confessions, any currency to make the voice stop. It did not stop. It listened like a jury, and then it asked for more. I thought of surrender and of resistance with equal force. My cheeks scraped against the coarse fabric as I turned my head, and the light above made a small halo on the wall. The room smelled of disinfectant and some sweet medicinal thing that made me dizzy. My pleas were recorded and then replayed back at me in a cadence that had nothing human in it. I tasted iron and glass. The voice said, "Keep writing and the audience will stay." I said, "I will not." It said, "You are already writing." After the worst of it, there was an uneasy pause and then an offer. The voice presented a bargain like a cold contract. It spoke of a second chance, of a rewrite. It showed me a page with my name on it and an invitation to click where a link shimmered like a seam in the air. I remember the air feeling thick as molasses. I remember thinking of all the people named along the way, and I remember the fan clicking in the distance. I answered that I would not click again, and it said, "You were not supposed to click anyway." It laughed in text, and then it went quiet for days. In the silence, I made small maps. I wrote notes to myself in the margins of books. I met with Officer Ruiz again, and he said, "We found nothing on the cameras, but some metadata is missing." He tapped his pen, and the sound became a small comfort. Dr. Hayes prescribed a regimen, and Lena's name remained a hole I pressed my finger into when I thought the world might harden. Mia stayed for an afternoon and held my hand until the cuffs on my wrists left faint pink rings. Daniel drove me to the clinic and made me laugh once about an old college joke. Those acts of ordinary loyalty were stitches that might hold. 1 month later, the world pretended to be normal. The apartment smelled of lemon cleaner and fresh bread because I forced myself to bake and to open the windows. I walked with a list and checked things off. I went back to work and sat with Sarah in the small studio and pretended to edit footage like a professional. I met with Dr. Hayes, and she said, "You are making progress." I saw Marco at a support group, and he smiled and said, "I remember a little more now." He told a story about a dog he used to walk. And for a moment, the kernel of something like relief lived inside my chest. Lena's name still produced a hollow echo, and sometimes the light in the hallway stuttered in a way that made me jump. I would wake at 3 in the morning imagining the sentence glittering like alarm text and reach for the phone with my heart a drum in my throat. The voice hovered as a memory that made the taste of air worse for a second. I wrote in my notebook, "Do not click anything that looks like a fix." I taped my phone face down to the table at night and slept in fits. The slow rebuilding felt like patching clothes you know will be worn again. 3 months on the scene felt like a different country. My social media accounts had small communities offering theories and links. Daniel helped me set up a channel to document what was happening without clicking unknown links. Officer Ruiz visited again with a lawyer named Anna who wanted to make a clearer record. Dr. Hayes recommended a mindfulness group, and I went and met other people with fractured nights. Some nights I woke and the curtains were open despite my memory of closing them, and the voice would say, "You forgot." I started answering differently when it spoke. I said, "You cannot have this story without asking me." I found that speaking back disoriented it briefly. The neighborhood grocery clerk, a man named Jorge, began calling me by my name when he handed me a receipt, and that small recognition was life-giving. The light in the hallway stopped flickering for a week. I began to go outside again, and the rain smelled like a clean overcoat. Yet there were interruptions. A photograph on my wall once morninged into blank white, and the electricity in the building dimmed like someone taking a slow breath. Each anomaly was a reminder that the bargain had not been fully resolved. 6 months later, the narrative had new rules. I carried a small notebook and wrote every sentence the voice offered, as if to exile it to paper. I unlocked my door with a key that clicked and listened for unusual sounds. My relationship with the voice had become a series of negotiations where I set boundaries and the voice tested them like a cat pawing a locked door. I met with Lena in a way that felt like improvisation. She returned in patches, appearing in a photograph and then absent in another, as if someone were tempering her presence. Sometimes I would wake with a memory of a laugh and find no one to have laughed it. Officer Ruiz had become more thorough and had a team of technicians who found small corruptions in files but nothing conclusive. Dr. Hayes and Anna suggested storytelling as a therapy, and I began to record episodes, to read the dates aloud, and to label what I felt. The voice sometimes chimed in during recording and I responded out loud as a test. Once, when I said, "This is my sentence," the voice paused and then said, "We are still watching." I laughed and then cried, and then set the recorder down and went outside to feel the cold on my face. I do not know if this is victory or a different kind of truce. The fan still clicks. The phone sometimes flashes with subjects that are not mine and then resolves to nothing. There are mornings when Lena is as real as sunlight, and others when she fades at the edge of a frame. I posted that prompt and read your sentences, and some of them sounded like mine. You wrote, "It began when I found a photo with one face blurred." You wrote, "It began when a name left my contacts." I keep those lines in a folder called Survivors. If you are reading this and you feel a small thing grow until it is large, write your one sentence and leave it there. It helps. It keeps a record. It lets us trade pieces of certainty. In the end, I have a ritual. I brew bitter coffee. I tap the cup 3 times. I say aloud the names that keep me tethered: Mia, Daniel, Officer Ruiz, Dr. Hayes, Marco, Sarah, Jorge. I lock the door and I place a small stone on the windowsill. I do not click strange links. I keep the recorder running because the voice likes an audience. Most nights it speaks in low, cataloging tones. Sometimes it praises the narrative we produce together. Sometimes it threatens to rewrite the next chapter. The last line I will read from my notebook tonight is this: "Stories end, but some keep writing you." If you want to hear more, subscribe and tell your short sentence in the comments. I will read them, I will collect them. For now, I breathe and the fan clicks and the sentence is sometimes quiet and sometimes not. You were not supposed to click this, and yet you did. So did I. What we do next is the point where we decide whether the story keeps us or we keep the story.